Marshal had not let a human hand near his mane since the morning Ruth Vale was buried. So when Jeremiah Vale stepped into the barn before sunrise and found a ragged little girl braiding the old horse's tangled hair as gently as a mother plaiting a child's, the bucket slipped from his hand and struck the dirt floor with a hollow clang. The horse did not startle. Neither did the girl. She only kept working in the blue half-light, thin fingers separating snarls while dawn leaked through the cracks in the boards. Marshal's breath steamed in the chill. Dust drifted in the beam beside them. Somewhere outside, a meadowlark called once and went quiet, as if the whole ranch had turned to listen. Then the child looked up. She could not have been more than 10. Her dress was too short at the wrists and ankles, the hem dry with old mud. A faded blue shawl hung crooked over one shoulder. Her eyes were dark and steady, too steady for a child. "I know I shouldn't be here," she said. But he looked lonely. Jeremiah forgot, for one clean second, how to breathe. No one in Bitter Creek said Ruth's name inside this barn anymore. Men stepped softer here. Even hired hands lowered their voices. The place still carried her in 100 small ways. The polished hook where she had hung her lantern, the currycomb with her initials cut into the handle, the empty nail where her blue apron used to dry. Since she died, Marshal had bitten one ranch hand, kicked another, and taken to standing at the fence after sunset, staring at the house as if grief might be called home by patience. Yet now he stood with one hind hoof cocked, eyelids lowered, while a stranger braided his mane with a strip of red thread pulled from her own frayed shawl. Jeremiah found his voice. "Who are you?" "May Bell Wren." She nodded toward the horse. "He don't like being rushed." The plainness of it nearly knocked a laugh out of him. He bent to right the bucket instead. "How'd you get on this ranch?" "Walked." She kept braiding. "Slept in Reverend Pike's wood shed." "Heard somebody in town say the widow ranch up the creek still had room for strays." "This isn't a widow ranch." That earned him a sidelong glance, solemn and unfold. "No, sir. It's a lonely one." The barn smelled of old hay, horse sweat, and oats. A draft slid under the door and brushed the back of his neck. He felt suddenly as if the room had opened somewhere behind his ribs and cold morning air was moving through places long nailed shut. Before we go farther, settle in wherever you are tonight, and let us know in the comments where you're listening from. Stories like this travel a long road before they find a home, and we always like knowing who's riding with us. Jeremiah took off one glove. "When did you last eat?" May Bell hesitated. "Yesterday, around noon." He should have sent her back at once. A widower alone with a stray girl under his roof was the kind of arrangement a small town could tear apart before dinner. His finances were already thin, his patience thinner. Sheriff Nolan Kearney had been circling the ranch for months, smiling too politely and asking too casually whether Jeremiah meant to keep up his payments through winter. Still, the child had found the one living creature on the place as broken-hearted as he was and soothed him without force. "Come to the house," he said. "There's biscuits left." She did not move. "Only if I can finish this side. Half a braid looks foolish." The laugh escaped him then, rough and startled. It felt strange coming out after 2 years of silence, like a rusted hinge giving way. May Bell's face changed at the sound. Not full trust. Not yet. But a tiny easing. That was the first question the morning laid at Jeremiah's feet. What sort of child spoke to sorrow, as though it were merely another skittish creature that needed patience? The second troubled him worse. Why had the sight of her in his barn felt, for one unguarded instant, like mercy? By sunrise, May Bell sat at his kitchen table with 2 biscuits, warm milk, and a heel of salt pork. She ate carefully rather than greedily, breaking each biscuit into pieces first, as if making sure there would still be food on the plate if the world changed its mind. Jeremiah stood by the stove pretending to mind the skillet. Morning light crossed the table and touched the red thread she had tied in Marshal's mane before coming in. A bright slash of color in a house that had forgotten bright things. "You got family?" he asked. She shook her head. "No ma? No pa. My ma died outside St. Joseph." Her fingers tightened around the mug. "My pa was never the staying kind." Jeremiah let the rest remain unsaid. The frontier was crowded with unfinished childhoods. "How'd you learn horses?" "Stockyard man used to let me sit the quiet ones while ma washed shirts. He said if you keep talking gentle, most creatures choose your voice over their fear." Jeremiah looked toward the barn. "That's so." May Bell nodded. Sometimes lonely listens better than force. The sentence landed between them with the clean weight of truth. He turned away under pretense of reaching for the coffee tin because he did not trust his face. Ruth had laughed with her whole body. She had planted an apple orchard everybody in Bitter Creek said would freeze to death. She sang to calves in storm season. She remembered which widows liked honey instead of sugar in their tea. 2 autumns ago, a buckboard will split on the South Road, and by the time Jeremiah reached her, the dust under her head had gone black with blood. He had not really lived since. He had only kept the ranch from dying out of habit and guilt. A knock came at the door close to 8. Reverend Pike stood there with his hat in both hands, beard still damp from his wash basin. His eyes moved from Jeremiah to May Bell and then to the extra plate on the table. "Morning," he said carefully. "I came to fetch the girl. Mrs. Colley says the wash house can hold her 2 nights till we find a more proper place." May Bell set down the last piece of biscuit without complaint. She did it so gently Jeremiah could almost hear all the other times people had decided her place for her. The right answer would have been yes. Let the church women sort her out. Let town mercy handle what town suspicion had not yet sharpened. But he pictured the Colley wash house, with drafts under every plank seam and Mrs. Colley counting soap, flour, and patience. He pictured this child being moved like a sack of seed from one temporary corner to another until winter or boredom swallowed her up. "She can stay here a while," Jeremiah heard himself say. Reverend Pike blinked. "Here. Bunkhouse loft's dry. She'll work for meals till something better's found." The preacher shifted uneasily. "Folks may talk. Folks always do." May Bell's hand flattened against the table as if she were steadying herself against a wind no one else could feel. "You certain?" the preacher asked. No, but certainty had not kept Ruth alive. Certainty had only left him with a silent house and a horse who watched for ghosts. "I'm certain enough," Jeremiah said. That was the point of no return. The room changed shape after the words left him. So did the morning. May Bell drew one careful breath, and the sound of hope entering a place long starved of it was so fragile he nearly flinched. By the time Reverend Pike rode back toward town, the storm had already chosen its direction. The bunkhouse loft had not held a sleeper in years. Dust lay thick on the boards. Jeremiah carried up a straw tick, 2 wool blankets, and a wash basin. May Bell swept, scrubbed, and hauled water with the determined silence of someone who believed hard work was the only language adults truly respected. Around noon, he saw the split near the base of her thumb and took the bucket from her. "Enough," he said. She reached for it again. "I can do more." "I didn't say you couldn't. I said enough." She froze, waiting for anger. He set the bucket down. "Listen to me. Under this roof, you eat first. You sleep warm. Nobody strikes you for being in the way. Those aren't wages. That's simply how things are done." Disbelief crossed her face faster than gratitude. "Yes, sir," she whispered. By evening, the whole of Bitter Creek knew. Jeremiah felt it when conversation thinned at Morrow's mercantile. Ada Morrow came around the counter with a brown parcel and pushed it into his hands. "Stockings. A comb. 2 shirts my niece outgrew. For the girl," she said. "Not for whatever pride you've got left." Before he could answer, the bell over the door jangled. Sheriff Nolan Kearney stepped in wearing polished boots and the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. Nolan had started life poor and never forgiven the world for noticing. Since winning the badge, he had collected influence the way magpies collected bright things. Councilmen drank with him. Bankers nodded too quickly around him. Men who feared him called it respect. "Vale," Nolan said lightly. "Heard you've taken up charitable work. Temporary arrangement. Nothing's temporary once tongues get moving. A child in a widower's house gives people ideas." Nolan glanced at the parcel in Jeremiah's hands. Men with overdue notes can't afford too many ideas attached to their name. Ada made a sound like a cupboard door slamming. Nolan ignored it. Jeremiah kept his voice flat. "If you have business, say it plain. Only concern. Your lower pasture touches the best creek bend in the valley. Be a shame if public unease forced the bank to reconsider your stability." His smile widened. "Would hate to see you lose the place over a sentimental impulse." There it was. Not gossip for gossip's sake. Pressure. He wanted the ranch, or at least the water rights. The coming rail rumor had every hungry man in 3 counties sniffing after creek bends and land deeds. Jeremiah rode home with Nolan's words clinging to him like burrs. That evening, May Bell sat on the porch rubbing tallow into the boots Ada had sent over. Crickets started up in the grass. Beyond the yard, Marshal grazed slow and contented in the last of the light. "Sheriff don't want me here," she said. "Sheriff wants whatever makes other folks obey faster." She worked the tallow into the leather. Places that love control always care about children last. He studied her profile in the violet evening. Some lines were too wise to belong to a 10-year-old. "You always talk like that. Only when I'm tired enough not to dress it up." She paused. "Why'd you keep me?" "Because you talked to my horse like you already understood mourning. Because you looked at my house and saw loneliness instead of acreage. Because when you smiled in that barn, the day stopped feeling like a punishment." He said only, "There was room." May Bell gave him a look that said she knew a half-truth when she heard one. Dark had nearly settled when Reverend Pike came back at a gallop. "Nolan's at the council room," he said. "Claims he has concerns about your temperament since Ruth passed. Says taking in the child proves the ranch is unstable." Amos Finch was with him. Jeremiah stood. Amos Finch was brother to the banker who held his note. What are they aiming at? Calling the note early and placing the girl under county authority. They want her sent north to the territorial home by week's end. May Bell went so still the porch seemed to swallow her. Jeremiah had once seen a boy return from one of those institutions after 4 years. The child had flinched every time a door latch lifted. "They can't do that on rumor," Jeremiah said. Reverend Pike gave a tired shake of the head. "Power rarely waits for better tools if a poor one will do." May Bell rose, boots clutched against her chest. "If I leave tonight, maybe he'll stop." Jeremiah looked at her then, really looked. The patched shawl, the careful bravery, the child already rehearsing how to disappear so adults could have an easier time. Something hot and old broke open in him. Men like Nolan counted on decent people stepping aside before the fight even started. Jeremiah straightened. "No, I'm tired of cruel men acting like caution belongs only to them. If you were standing on that porch, what would you have done? Would you have protected your own fragile peace, or risked everything for a child who had no one else? Tell us in the comments. The hardest choices in a life are usually the ones that show us most clearly what sort of soul we've been carrying." May Bell stared at him as if she had never seen a person refuse convenience on her behalf. Then she said, very softly, "There is something I heard." In the kitchen, with both hands around a cold mug so they would not shake, she told them what she had never told anyone. She had not slept near the church her first night in Bitter Creek. She had hidden under the loading dock behind Nolan Kearney's new freight warehouse because it was dry. Through the warped planks above her, she had heard 2 men talking. One was Nolan. The other, she was nearly certain, was Amos Finch. They were laughing about the water survey, she said. One said your land deed wouldn't matter once the original disappeared with the widow's papers. Then the sheriff said, "He's half buried in grief. Give me a week and I'll have the Vale place without firing a shot." Jeremiah felt all the warmth go out of the room. Ruth had kept the original deed and tax records in a blue tin dispatch box. After her death, he had looked once, maybe twice, through drawers and shelves, then quit when every paper she touched felt like a blade turned in a wound. He had assumed the box remained somewhere in the house. He went to the alcove, hauled the cedar chest from beneath the bed, and dug under dresses, letters, and a Bible until he found the box. Unlocked. Empty. His fist struck the wall before he knew he had clenched it. "He stole from a dead woman," Jeremiah said. May Bell looked up sharply. "I know where he keeps papers." Both men turned. "Upstairs office in the warehouse." He opened a wall cupboard. "I saw it through a crack from under the dock." There were rolled maps and stacked boxes. One box had blue paint on the corner. Reverend Pike drew back. "Child, I will not have you mixed in burglary." "Then don't call it that," she said. "Call it a small person finally being useful in a place built by men too proud to look down." Jeremiah met her eyes. There it was again, that quiet gift for speaking truth without reaching for it. Lawful roads existed, yes, but lawful roads favored whichever man owned the sheriff, the banker, or both. Nolan had stepped off that road when he stole a dead woman's papers and used a child as leverage. Jeremiah made his choice. Reverend Pike would wake Ada Morrow and her husband Caleb, once a deputy and still the one man in town whose silence made bullies nervous. They would bring witnesses and, if need be, the judge. Meanwhile, Jeremiah would go to the warehouse, recover the papers if they were there, and keep Nolan from shaping the story first. I'm coming, May Bell said. Absolutely not. You won't find the cupboard in the dark. I will. And if he means to send me north, I'm already in it whether you like it or not. He hated the truth of that. Hated more that she was right. They rode the bay mare into town under a moon narrow as a clipped fingernail. Night in Bitter Creek sounded different from day, quieter on the surface, meaner underneath. Saloon laughter drifted from one end of the street. A dog barked once and was shushed. The warehouse stood on the north side by the cottonwoods, broad-shouldered and new, built with money Nolan claimed came from prudent investments. A faint line of lamplight showed beneath the upstairs office curtain. Nolan was there. Finch, too. Their voices spilled through the siding when Jeremiah and May Bell crept close enough. Call the note in the morning, Finch said. Council will back removal of the child on moral grounds. Once Vale's off the land, the transfer's clean. Nolan chuckled. He's too honest to cheat and too broken to fight well. The perfect combination. Jeremiah's hand closed on the rail until old splinters bit his skin. May Bell touched his sleeve. He bent close. Get under the dock. If you find the box, bring it straight out. No lingering. You neither, she whispered. He circled to the rear stairs while she vanished beneath the loading platform like smoke. The office door stood just barely ajar. Through the gap, he saw Nolan leaning over a desk, one hand on a bottle, the other on a stack of papers. Finch sat by the stove mopping sweat from his lip. Jeremiah was deciding whether to wait for May Bell or kick the door in when a sharp crack sounded from below, with splintering. Nolan straightened. What was that? He grabbed a lantern and pistol and strode for the landing. Jeremiah hit him shoulder first before the sheriff cleared the doorway. The lantern swung wild. Nolan fired on reflex, the shot blasting into darkness and sending dogs into a frenzy all across town. Finch shouted. The lantern struck the rail and went out. They crashed against the wall and down 2 steps together. Nolan fought mean and close, elbows and knees and dirty little punches under the ribs. Finch came out of the office with a stove poker and clipped Jeremiah's shoulder hard enough to light his arm with fire. Then from beneath the dock came May Bell's voice. Mr. Vale. Something flew upward through the dark. He caught it by instinct. Tin. Cold edges. A latch. The blue dispatch box. Nolan saw it even in the blackness and made a sound that stripped every last scrap of politeness from him. He tore free and lunged, not to escape, Jeremiah realized, but to get the box and destroy whatever was inside. Jeremiah hurled it through the office doorway and drove after him. Nolan fired again. The bullet tore a splinter from the rail beside Jeremiah's ear. He kept moving. Cruel men relied too much on the belief that decent men would always stop short. At the bottom of the stairs, Nolan spun, pistol rising for a third shot. And May Bell stepped from under the dock, holding a brass key between 2 fingers. Looking for this? She asked. The key to the office cupboard. Nolan's eyes flicked toward her. 1 heartbeat. No more. Jeremiah slammed into him low and hard. They hit the yard in a churn of dust and broken slats. The pistol flew. Nolan clawed for it. Jeremiah caught his wrist and smashed it against a post until the weapon dropped from numb fingers. Lantern light flooded the yard from the alley. Caleb Morrow stood there with Reverend Pike, Ada, and 2 ranchers behind them. Caleb had Amos Finch by the collar. Ada held the dispatch box against her apron like a church relic. The fight went out of Nolan all at once. But the storm was not finished. Because when Ada opened the box right there in the yard, it held far more than Jeremiah's deed. On top lay the deed and tax records, yes. Under them sat forged surveys and signed transfer papers, mortgage drafts bearing Finch's seal, and a folded list of names, widows, aging ranchers, one-handed laborers, families deep in debt. Beside each name stood a number and a note in Nolan's own hand. Creek rights, timber strip, likely no contest, isolate first. Jeremiah looked at the page and felt the night tilt. This had never been only about his ranch. Nolan had built himself a business out of the vulnerable. Mrs. Larkin's place. Tomas Reed's North Field. The Haviland sisters' grazing lot. People who lived too alone, mourned too publicly, or owed too much. He had been circling them all. Caleb gave a long exhale. That'll hang a man higher than stealing cattle. Nolan was breathing hard in the dust, collar torn, one wrist useless. Even now he tried for dignity. You break into my office and expect papers out of context to save you? May Bell stepped closer than Jeremiah liked. One boot was gone. Dust coated her bare foot. But her voice did not shake. You said grief wasn't a legal strategy. Silence rolled through the yard. Everyone heard it. Everyone understood what it meant. Nolan's face changed then, not to remorse, but to recognition. He knew he had lost the crowd. And once a bully loses the crowd, his strength starts leaking out faster than blood. Reverend Pike said quietly, "Seems to me we have all the context we require." Bitter Creek's jail had only 2 cells. Before dawn, Nolan Kearney and Amos Finch occupied one together, while Caleb sat outside with a shotgun and Ada brewed coffee strong enough to strip wagon paint. Judge Mercer was woken from bed, shown the deed, shown the forged surveys, shown the list. By noon, people who had kept their heads down for months began arriving with testimony. Truth does not topple power merely because it exists. It topples power when witnesses finally decide they are tired of lying on its behalf. Jeremiah rode home after sunrise with May Bell beside him and the blue dispatch box between them. His shoulder burned. His jaw ached. Every muscle felt used. Yet the valley seemed to have widened around him. Frost lingered in the deepest shade. The creek sounded clearer than usual. At the crossing, he pulled the horse to a halt. May Bell looked up, wary. Did I do wrong? The question hit him harder than Finch's poker had. He climbed down, came around, and held out his good hand. She took it after the smallest pause, and together they sat on the grassy bank while cold water worried over stones below them. Ruth's orchard stood up the rise behind the house. A hawk wheeled over the meadow. The air smelled of creek moss, leather, and pine warming under the sun. Ruth wanted children, Jeremiah said. The words came slowly, but not like knives anymore. We lost 2 babies before they ever learned air. After that, the doctor said maybe no more. When she died, I figured whatever room in me had been built for family got buried with her. May Bell tucked her hands beneath her thighs. And now, he thought of Marshal lowering his head into her touch. Of the fearless way she had stepped into lantern light with nothing but a key and a steady voice. Of how quickly the house had remembered sound. Now I think empty rooms can sound different once somebody starts living in them. She blinked hard and stared at the creek. He reached into his coat and laid the length of red thread from Marshal's braid across her palm. You were right this morning, he said. He was lonely. Her fingers closed over the thread. So were you. No grand speech. No prettied-up sentiment. Just truth sitting down between them like an old friend finally invited inside. He nodded. Yes. She drew a careful breath. If I stayed, I could help with Marshal. And I could learn letters proper. I'd earn my. Jeremiah shook his head. A child shouldn't have to earn the right to be safe. Work's one thing. Belonging is another. Her mouth trembled. Nobody ever said that to me. Then they were poorer company than I mean to keep. If this story is touching something tender in you, you are exactly who we had in mind while telling it. A like and a subscribe lets us keep bringing these people home, one hard-won ending at a time. May Bell laughed and cried in the same breath, which seemed to Jeremiah the most honest sound a person could make. When he opened his arm, awkward as a man unpracticed in comfort, she stepped into him and held on as if she had been falling for years and had finally met ground. He rested his chin on the top of her head and looked toward Ruth's house. For the first time since her burial, it did not seem to accuse him of still being alive. It seemed to invite him in. Warmth did not mean safety yet. There would be hearings, paperwork, questions from county officers who trusted forms more than faces. But when they reached the ranch, Ada Morrow was already there with eggs, flour, and 3 hens in a crate. Caleb came an hour later with a hammer and fresh hinges for the bunkhouse. Reverend Pike brought a primer, slate, and chalk. By evening, Mrs. Larkin had sent 2 quilts, and Tomas Reed had repaired the chicken run without being asked. The valley had begun, slowly, to choose its side where everyone could see. Some still muttered that a child and widower made an untidy household. But untidy and wrong were different species, and the town had finally learned how one smelled compared to the other. Jeremiah moved May Bell from the bunkhouse loft to the cabin alcove where Ruth's sewing table had once stood. He built a narrow bed from spare pine boards. Ada stitched curtains from feed sacks printed with faded blue roses. Marshal, having accepted the child as one of his peculiar herd, began waiting at the gate each morning for her to come rub the white star on his forehead. In the evenings, she practiced letters by firelight. One night, she paused over a word in Reverend Pike's primer and sounded it out slowly. belong. Then she looked around the room. The lamp glow, the kettle, the patched rug, the red thread tied now to a nail above the hearth. I think I'm learning what that means. The hearing was held 10 days later in the church hall because the council room could not hold the crowd. Territorial investigators had already stripped Nolan of his badge and frozen Amos Finch's accounts. More names kept surfacing, more forged signatures, more land transfers built on intimidation and missing papers. Jeremiah testified. So did Caleb, Ada, Reverend Pike, Mrs. Larkin, Tomas Reed, and a dozen others Nolan had assumed too weary or too frightened to speak. Finally, May Bell stood on an apple crate so the room could hear her plainly. She told exactly what she had heard beneath the dock, exactly what she had seen in the cupboard, exactly what Nolan said about grief. The lawyer hired to protect Nolan tried to rattle her. You're an orphan child with no fixed residence. How are we to know you didn't misunderstand what grown men were discussing? May Bell folded her hands in front of her. Small ain't the same as foolish. Folks keep mixing those up. A murmur moved through the hall then. Not amusement, but recognition. An entire room understanding at once that the child had named a truth larger than the case itself. Judge Mercer granted Jeremiah temporary guardianship that afternoon pending territorial adoption papers. It was not the finish, but it was law, and for once law had arrived facing in the right direction. As for Nolan and Finch, they were carried north in irons before first snow. Fraud, theft, conspiracy, abuse of office, property seized, accounts examined. Several stolen parcels restored to the families from whom they had been squeezed. The warehouse sold at auction. Part of Nolan's remaining assets, at Ada Morrow's insistence and with Judge Mercer's blessing, went into a relief fund for widows and orphan children so no one in Bitter Creek would again be forced to bargain with a wolf for the price of staying warm. That was justice, complete and public. But grace arrived in quieter clothing. Finch Bank, desperate to look clean of Amos Finch's schemes, restructured Jeremiah's note at terms a man could survive. Creek rights remained with the ranch. Ruth's orchard, stubborn as prophecy, yielded its first serious crop that autumn. Reverend Pike came every Thursday to hear May Bell read. Ada taught her to mend a hem properly. Caleb carved her a whistle from cedar. Even the old ranch hands, drifting through for day work, stopped pretending the house ought to remain dim forever. On the first cold morning of October, Jeremiah drove the final nail into May Bell's proper bed frame. She stood in the doorway clutching her primer and said, with all the gravity of a vow, "My ma would have liked it here." He set down the hammer. I think Ruth would have too. Weeks later, Reverend Pike arrived with territorial papers sealed in oilskin. Frost silvered the pasture. Smoke rose straight from the chimney. May Bell was in the yard trying to persuade Marshal that a wool scarf could improve a horse's appearance. Approved, Reverend Pike said, handing Jeremiah the papers. His own eyes looked suspiciously damp. If the child consents. Jeremiah read every line twice before calling her over. She came with one hand buried in Marshal's mane and listened while he read aloud the formal words that turned safety into law. When he finished, she asked the question that mattered most. Do I have to stop being May Bell Wren? Not a bit, he said. A person gets to keep every good piece they survived with. Sunlight struck her face then, and it changed her whole expression from caution to wonder. Then I'll be May Bell Wren Vale, she said. So nobody gets left behind. There are names you inherit, names you borrow, and names you build one brave day at a time. The best of them feel less like ownership than arrival. Winter passed. Then spring came up the valley in green seams along the creek banks. By April, the red thread above the hearth had faded soft as an old rose petal, and by May Marshal had learned to stand patient while May Bell braided his mane with proper ribbon Ada bought from the mercantile. Jeremiah replanted 2 apple trees that never should have survived the last frost, but somehow had. He found himself speaking aloud in the barn again, sometimes to the horse, sometimes to Ruth, more and more often to the future. One warm evening near the end of planting season, with apple blossoms breathing through the open window and hens muttering themselves to sleep under the coop, Jeremiah stood in the cabin doorway listening to May Bell read from the porch swing in a voice as clear and steady as creek water. She stumbled once, laughed at herself, and began the sentence again while Marshal grazed beneath the orchard and the last sunlight turned the meadow to gold. Funny thing about the heart, leave it shut too long and it grows wild with sorrow. But give it one true soul to shelter and it remembers, all on its own, how to become a home. Beyond the porch, the ranch settled into evening so gently it seemed the whole valley had finally exhaled around them. Next time, we'll tell the story of a deaf seamstress sent to a remote cattle camp because her brothers were ashamed of her, and the one-eyed trail boss who noticed, before anyone else did, that silence was the sharpest kind of witness.